On this Wednesday night, beating the heat, more record-breaking temperatures.
It's going to get a lot worse.
Raising fears for the vulnerable and Canadian farmers. Taking a bite out of the grocery bill. The government rolls out a rebate, but will it satisfy shoppers? A 48-year-old cold case cracked. How new technology identified an American woman murdered in Ontario.
Global National with Donna Friesen. Reporting tonight, Jeff Semple.
Good evening and thank you for joining us. This summer is off to a sweltering start, with tens of millions in North America under heat warnings tonight, and temperature records are falling fast. 2016 and 2020 were the hottest years on record, according to NASA. But this year, average temperatures are trending even higher. Last month was the warmest June ever recorded, and Monday and Tuesday of this week also set new records for the hottest days ever, with yesterday's average global temperature climbing to 17.18 degrees. Experts expect more record-breaking heat in the weeks ahead, and there's growing concern for the vulnerable, those without the means to escape the scorching temperatures. Eric Sorensen has our top story tonight.
They're outside, they're basically just surviving.
Jacinda Hudson is distributing water, checking up on the homeless in downtown Toronto. They live in tents and are among the most vulnerable Canadians facing a future with increasing heat every summer.
They're doing the best that they can with what they have, but I mean, that's why we're here. We're trying to assist, trying to help out, just give some water and at least alleviate a little bit of stress from them.
It's not inner city, it's every city. The elderly living alone on low incomes are also at risk, and those with pre-existing health conditions.
When the heat events hit, we have to map out where are these people in society, where are they living, and we have to make sure that we have people checking on them on a regular basis.
It's not just the heat, it's the humidity.
The more humid it is, the more difficult it is, and the slower it is for us to be able to transfer heat out of our body.
Ira Jacobs says the risk climbs when the humidex reaches 40 if people can't cool off.
We can in fact do damage to cells and key organs in our body because of the temperature that actually occurs inside of our body.
Social service agencies says this is especially true for the unhoused, who often have poor health and habits on top of life on the street.
You turn up some of the vulnerabilities that are inherent in heat, and it's going to increase the vulnerability. It will reduce their resiliency to bounce back from many of the traumas that they face on a daily basis.
The World Health Organization reports tens of millions more people around the world are exposed to heat waves than a generation ago. Under the 2021 heat dome over British Columbia, around 600 people died from extreme heat. Last week, BC began accepting applications for 8,000 free air conditioning units for low-income, medically vulnerable people. And Ottawa announced it's working with provinces on a $1.5 billion plan for climate adaptation that communities will need.
We must also make our communities more resilient to the impacts of climate change.
As challenging as extreme heat may be at this moment, it's going to get a lot worse, period, across Canada.
Climate adaptation policies will take years to roll out, but the needs of the vulnerable are immediate. The heat is everywhere and increasing, and so is the population most at risk. Eric Sorensen, Global News, Toronto.
Those high temperatures combined with a lack of rain are causing droughts for Canadian farmers. In Alberta, some key growing regions have received less than 50 millimeters of moisture since the beginning of May. Several communities have declared agricultural disasters. That happens when 50 to 90% of a municipality is experiencing extreme loss of crops. Foothills County, south of Calgary, was the latest to reach that grim threshold, declaring a disaster last week. It joins 3 other municipalities in Alberta's southern farming community, with others expected to follow in the coming weeks. As Heather Yourex-West explains, the conditions are now forcing some farmers to reassess their futures.
Ryan Cook is a cattle rancher. Nothing is more important than his herd. His central Alberta farm has spent years perfecting its breeding program. It's why this year is so heartbreakingly hard.
I think we'll have to sell some, not sure yet. The genetics you bring in and produce is what makes your cow herd better, and it takes a lifetime to build that up. So it's basically you're throwing away a lifetime if you have to sell them.
Drought conditions in Stettler County mean this farm likely won't have enough feed to get their cattle through the winter. Across Alberta, Cook is far from alone.
Before July, to have that already headed out like that, like it's not growing any more than that.
In south and central Alberta, 4 counties have declared an agricultural disaster. For some farms, the lack of rain and high temperatures have resulted in 90% crop loss. The Alberta government says it's monitoring the situation closely as soil moisture levels in central and southern Alberta hit 50-year lows.
This year I had to truck all of our cattle up north for pasture because there was none down here.
It could turn into the top 5 worst crops we've ever had for sure. And like I said, this will be 6 out of 7 years that we've had a dip into crop insurance. I spent $600,000 on crop insurance premiums this year.
And while 1 year of drought is hard enough, many areas have been dealing with several seasons with very little rain. Here in Stettler County, a disaster has been declared in 3 of the last 6 years, prompting concerns over what's to come.
It's hard to continue on when the resources aren't there to carry you.
An industry as iconic to Alberta as oil, struggling through season after season without enough rain. Heather Yourex-West, Global News, Stettler County, Alberta.
The government's grocery rebate is rolling out today to help low-income Canadians with the rising cost of living. Around 11 million Canadians are receiving the one-time payment, arriving by check or direct deposit, alongside July's GST tax credit. Those funds were promised in the federal budget with a price tag of $2.5 billion. Touria Izri reports on whether the rebate will offer any relief.
I got a watermelon, pineapple, 2 ground beef.
This is what $50 gets you at the grocery store.
My money only goes to my food and my rent, and there's nothing left for my tuition.
This university student will have a bit more wiggle room. A few $100s is coming her way. She's one of millions of Canadians receiving a one-time payment the government has branded as a grocery rebate. Families with children are getting between $387 and $628. Single Canadians are receiving $234, while seniors are getting $225.
I'll take whatever they give.
Okay.
It's very expensive to today's world.
The money doesn't have to go towards buying groceries. It can be spent on anything. But for this mother, the rebate barely covers her monthly bill for formula and diapers.
Every week and a half, at least I'm spending about $140, $120, and that's not touching groceries.
The average family is spending roughly $1,000 more this year than last on food.
For the people who need it the most, it's going to make a difference. Is it going to cover everything? No.
Ottawa insists it needs to strike a balance to avoid fueling inflation.
Those untargeted measures can be kind of worrisome. The good news is that the GST credit is actually very well targeted.
Some Canadians believe the rebate is the wrong approach. They want the government to fight price gouging at the grocery store instead.
Because there are so few major chains, it is reducing competition, which doesn't provide much incentive for people to keep their prices very low.
Only Canadians who have filed their taxes will qualify for the so-called grocery rebate. Ottawa plans to introduce automatic filing so that vulnerable Canadians don't miss out on their benefits. But advocates insist the best way for the government to reduce poverty is by investing in housing. Touria Izri, Global News, Ottawa.
Turning to breaking news now, Ottawa has just struck a deal with Stellantis and LG Energy Solutions. That means the construction of their electric vehicle battery plant in Windsor, Ontario is back on track. The two companies made the announcement after reaching a financing deal with the federal government. Construction stalled earlier this year after the companies demanded more government funding to match what the U.S. would offer under its new Inflation Reduction Act. Police in Quebec say 2 bodies have been found near the site of Saturday's landslide that hit the province's Saguenay-Lac-Saint-Jean region. A state of emergency was declared after the local river swelled to 4 times its size from torrential rains. Dozens were forced to evacuate, and 2 people were reported missing, a man and woman in their 40s. Quebec's coroner's office has so far identified one of the bodies as 48-year-old Pascal Ayon from the Quebec City region. Ontario police have cracked one of Canada's oldest cold cases, dating back almost half a century. The victim was known only as the Nation River Lady after her body was found floating in the Nation River east of Ottawa back in 1975. She has now finally been identified as Jewel Parchman Langford. Investigators say the breakthrough was thanks to advances in DNA testing technology, like the kind used to determine someone's ancestry.
The DNA sample was linked with others through a genealogy and family tree analysis, and raised a good potential that the unidentified remains were Ms. Langford.
In 2020, a new DNA profile was created, and within a few weeks, Langford was identified as the likely candidate. Investigators believe this is the first case in Canada where human remains have been identified using forensic genealogy. Langford was first reported missing after arriving in Montreal from Tennessee, and police have now charged 81-year-old Florida man Rodney Nichols with her murder. On the eve of the 10th anniversary of one of Canada's worst rail disasters in Lac-Mégantic, people in the community are calling for more action to avoid another tragedy. Tomorrow marks a decade since 47 people were killed after a runaway train carrying crude oil derailed on the main street of the small town. Lac-Mégantic has never been the same, and as Dan Spector reports, the community says there's been little progress to improve rail safety.
It's one of those towns where everyone knows everyone, which is a major reason the hellish night that marked this place a decade ago has been so hard to forget.
We lost our heart, you know.
July 6th, 2013, just after 1 o'clock in the morning, a runaway train carrying 72 tanker cars full of crude oil derailed and exploded in the town center, killing 47 people and destroying dozens of buildings. The train's brakes failed while it was parked up the hill in the neighboring town of Nantes. It picked up speed as it barreled down the slope before derailing at the curve.
Pas de lumière, pas de brake.
There were no lights, no brakes. Gilles Fluet says the train rushed silently by him that night without a sound. Minutes before, he'd left the downtown bar where many of the victims lived their final moments. 10 years later, there's still a curve in the middle of town.
Une frustration.
The mayor says today's trains are longer than ever, creating constant concern. She says plans are moving forward to create a rail bypass around the town, though even that has sparked controversy among the 42 landowners affected.
Stonedale Zero came out.
Gilbert Carrette is part of a citizens group that has been lobbying for better rail safety ever since the disaster. They watched the tracks closely, and this week they posted a video of tracks moving up and down at this location. He says over the years his group has flagged many sections of track they see as poorly maintained.
I do think that profits are running before people's safety.
Canada has tightened rail regulations, added inspectors, but rail expert Ian Nash says the rules aren't always enforced.
I'd say they just haven't used them enough, and they can be a lot harsher.
He also says companies are cutting corners on safety in the name of profits, though the Canadian Rail Association counters that, saying every railroader's singular mission is to deliver the goods Canadians need and use every day safely.
A candlelight walk will take place just after 1 o'clock Thursday morning, around the same time the catastrophe began to unfold 10 years ago. Tomorrow, people will lay flowers along the tracks downtown, and at noon, the church bell will toll 47 times, one for each of the dead. Jeff.
Dan Spector in Lac-Mégantic, Quebec tonight. Thanks, Dan. Taking on the tech giants. Coming up, the federal government's message for Meta. In a first-of-its-kind case in Canada, the RCMP have charged an Ottawa man with both terrorism and hate offences. 26-year-old Patrick Gordon MacDonald is charged with 3 counts of terrorism-related activities, including the willful promotion of hatred. It's alleged he helped produce propaganda material for a hate group. These are screenshots of videos from that neo-Nazi group, which is listed as a terrorist organization in Canada. A second unnamed person from Kinsey Falls, Quebec, was also arrested. A new development tonight in the federal government's dispute with American tech giants over its Online News Act. The Heritage Minister says the government is suspending advertising on Facebook and Instagram. The move follows Meta's decision to block news content on its platforms to avoid paying publishers. Mackenzie Gray reports on the potential impact and the hopes for a deal.
Once in a while, eh? It's a rare show of parliamentary unity. The Liberals, NDP and Bloc appearing together to support the Online News Act and to push back against one of the tech giants.
We are announcing the Government of Canada will be suspending advertising on Facebook and Instagram.
But the move will likely have little impact. The Fed spent only $11 million last year on Facebook and Instagram ads, a drop in the ocean to the more than $4 billion in revenue Meta makes in Canada alone. And the ban only extends to the government. The Liberal Party itself, which has used social media ads extensively during elections, will continue to work with Instagram and Facebook, a contradiction the Prime Minister couldn't explain.
As for other organizations like political parties and others, I'm sure there will be more decisions taken in the coming days.
Google and Meta have both said they'll block Canadian news from Canadian users after Parliament passed new legislation forcing tech giants to cut deals with media publishers for sharing and directing users to online news content. The Heritage Minister is still confident a deal can be reached with Google, but the Conservatives say the law is flawed.
Unfortunately, because of this government's illogical tactic and lack of common sense, it is Canadians who are going to be harmed.
The Parliamentary Budget Officer estimated the new law would cost Meta and Google roughly $300 million annually, but the Silicon Valley giants likely view this as a bigger fight, with similar legislation to the Canadian model being considered in California, the world's fifth biggest economy.
The user experience for the average Facebook user popping up and saying you can't share news on this platform is a bad experience. And I think they know that. They're just willing to take on that risk in hopes of trying to stop similar legislation globally.
The federal government wasn't the only entity to cut advertising with Meta. The province of Quebec and Quebecor, which owns multiple media organizations, also announced similar bans. Jeff?
Mackenzie Gray in Ottawa. Thanks, Mac. Still ahead, Ukraine and Russia accuse each other of planning to attack Europe's largest nuclear plant. Hundreds of Palestinians took part in a funeral procession for those killed in an Israeli raid. Mourners marched through the Jenin refugee camp, where 12 Palestinians were killed in the two-day raid. It was one of the biggest Israeli military operations in the West Bank in 2 decades. One Israeli was also killed. Israel has now withdrawn its troops, but fighting continues. Today, Palestinian militants fired rockets from Gaza. The Israeli military says they were intercepted by its air defense systems. Ukraine and Russia are accusing each other of plotting to sabotage one of the world's largest nuclear plants. Ukraine claims Russia has planted objects resembling explosives on the roof of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. Russia says that's nonsense. UN inspectors also say they've seen no evidence of that. The plant has been the target of attacks on and off for more than a year. Russia seized that facility in the first days of its full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Scotland presented King Charles with the country's crown jewels. The ceremony in Edinburgh was held to honour the new monarch's coronation. The day of pomp and pageantry was also marked by protests along Scotland's Royal Mile, with some in the crowd chanting, "Not my king." And that is Global National for this Wednesday night. I'm Jeff Semple. Tonight's Your Canada is Minto Bridge in Ottawa's Rockcliffe Park. Thanks for watching. Hope to see you back here again tomorrow. Have a great night.